Conference realignment is touching all parts of college football, but it seems like Notre Dame has abstained for as long as anybody else, and maybe they'll hold out the longest, but we're going to talk about that with Joe DeLeon of the Ruffino and Joe Show. Joe, I appreciate you joining me. What do Notre Dame fans feel? And we talked about different pockets of Notre Dame fans, so maybe there's a couple of answers to this, but what do Notre Dame fans in general feel about realignment and pertaining to Notre Dame specifically?
Yeah, I think that this is one subject that every Notre Dame fan is joined in on, feeling that they should never join a conference. And I'm not one of those Notre Dame folks that agrees with that. I think that if you are paying attention to the broader scope of how the college football is moving and where we're going to, you talk to athletic directors. I spoke to an FCS athletic director today, and he even thinks that very confidently was saying we're moving towards a Power 2. Notre Dame won't be in a position where they're going to get left out or going to have last pick. They're always going to be one of the teams, one of the biggest brands in the sport that is going to be highly sought after. But at a certain point, the decision is going to be made for them. They're not going to be in this position where they can abstain and play against the Power 2 and be the only independent team. That's just not going to work out. I understand where the desire to remain in control of your destiny is, but we're getting to this point where the TV contracts are just getting so big that they're going to want to be a part of whether it's the SEC or the Big 10.
Yeah, that's my thought. And they've got, Notre Dame does a ton, and has an endowment that's unlike many people's, and they've got ancillary money that comes in, but eventually, the prestige or just whatever the thought around staying independent is, the honor, the respect, however you want to look at that, it's just like, is that worth $40 million a year? And that's, is that worth, if it's worth that much money, then stay out. Also access, I agree that Notre Dame, I don't think that something like what happened to Florida State this year would ever happen to Notre Dame, right? I think that brand would be big enough, but Notre Dame's in a spot where they're 10-2 and an SEC team is 9-3 and they're fighting it out for that last spot. And you've got Greg Sankey breathing down your neck. What's the committee do? Right. And I know Notre Dame fans may jump in the comments and jump down my throat and say like, no, that would never happen to us. Listen, I'm a Florida State guy. I never thought it happened to us either. Like, I know that Florida State's brand is not Notre Dame's. I never thought it would happen to us either. And so I'm just throwing it out there. I don't know that I think, the money is one thing, but access is a big reason. And we'll talk about Florida State and Clemson in a minute, but I think that's another big reason why a lot of teams feel like they've got to do something at some point.
Yeah. That's where I come down on is it's funny. I'm not an alum of Notre Dame, but my dad is. So it's really funny that I get to use that as my barometer on expectations of Notre Dame fans because I just pick up the phone and I call him and he'll always bring up something. And every time we talk about conference realignment, it's like every single, you would expect from a 60-year-old graduate of Notre Dame to be saying, we've been independent for so long. We're the biggest brand in college football, but that world is so different than what it was in the 90s. And I'm not saying that Notre Dame is no longer capable of being successful. All I'm trying to say is that a lot of these other programs have caught up that maybe you wouldn't have expected would have caught up. But the biggest piece that you're talking about now is the playoff and the way that they're going to possibly be not phased out, but in a way they're a little boxed out. It really sucks that Notre Dame has no opportunity to earn a seed if they go undefeated. If they go undefeated this year, the best that they could be is the 5 seed, I believe. I don't think that I'm missing anything there. The rules of the new playoff are still to be not to be determined, but need to get caught up with that. But my point is that sucks. If Notre Dame has an amazing season where they look really good against Texas A&M and they beat Florida State and they embarrass USC and they just fly through their schedule, that is really lame that they can't be one of the top 3 teams in college football. So at a certain point, things like that are going to sway the decision.
Everyone seems to assume that Notre Dame will wind up in the Big 10. I think every single one of Notre Dame's natural rivals is in the Big 10 outside of Stanford. A lot of people think they'll end up there eventually too, maybe at a reduced rate. But let's buck the trend. Any chance at the SEC, and outside of money, like what would it take or what would be the perception if they ended up where no one thinks they end up in the Southeastern Conference.
Yeah, I just feel like that. I mean, culturally, it just doesn't feel right, and I think also geographically, Notre Dame, when they make decisions like this, they are really, really, really strategic about doing what they decide to do. And I think that they would approach it as, okay, we get to play Purdue and Michigan State and Michigan again, and we get to revitalize what was the biggest rivalries and some of the best games in the history of our program was playing those teams. It feels weird. It almost feels like I don't know what Sankey's perception of this is, and it all kind of comes down to him, but Notre Dame is one of those teams where the SEC collectively just feels like they hate them and that they wouldn't exactly be excited inviting them to the party and just kind of giving them more, fuel to the fire to, say that they're amongst the elite. I think that they would be one of those conferences or the conference that would say that they don't really want Notre Dame.
Yeah. To me, it wouldn't make a lot of sense either, although I don't know that, Florida State and Clemson in the Big 10 make a lot of sense, with, the way that we're going about things and the way that teams are landing. But Notre Dame in the SEC would not make sense. But I almost just wonder if there's a dollar amount that just is so outrageous and Sankey does it, right? And pulls the trigger, and Notre Dame's like, man, we cannot not do this. And so I don't know. It would feel weird.
Yeah.
So strange. As an outsider who doesn't really care where or if Notre Dame ends up, I'd love it just because it'd be crazy. We're probably going to merge into some big super conference at some point anyway. So
Right.
I don't know, I think it'd be wild. Speaking on Florida State and Clemson, I know you guys have talked about this a little bit on the Ruffino and Joe show, which you guys should certainly go check out. We'll link down in the description. It's probably one, and Blake Ruffino is a co-host there with Joe. It's honestly, I'm not just saying this because Joe's on, because I haven't said this about a lot of other people that we've had on. It's really one of my favorite shows that that I get a chance to listen to and catch. It's a lot of fun giving Blake a hard time. So if you like LSU guy be given a really hard time, it's you'll enjoy that.
Of course.
Yeah, all you Brian Kelly fans will love hearing the Notre Dame guy, the LSU guy get a hard time. So, Florida State and Clemson, thoughts on that situation, where they likely end up, the kind of maybe what seems to be the next move in college football.
Yeah, I think that so my full-time job, I'm a producer for the College Football Inquirer, which is Ross Dellinger, Pat Forty, and Dan Wetzel. And Ross today talked about on the show how UNC makes the most sense as the first team to really impact this wave of realignment. And it sounds like at ACC meetings this week, they are the team that might be causing the biggest commotion. And it makes a lot of sense, because if you look at the SEC footprint of, if they're just trying to acquire specific teams and regions, they've got Florida, they've got South Carolina, but they don't have anybody in North Carolina necessarily, and they don't have a premier basketball entity like North Carolina. That's something that I think it's forgotten a lot with this realignment stuff, is that these conferences at the same time are going to want to make moves to improve other sports. If they can add North Carolina into the mix, that's going to be huge for them. And it sounds like North Carolina is extremely frustrated by the fact that they're doing everything right from an athletic department standpoint. In football, they've improved vastly. Basketball, they're constantly in the national championship conversation and in the conversation for the best recruits. They've got one of the best coaches in the country for basketball for them. And they are getting peanuts, it feels like, compared to some of these other conferences in the SEC and the Big 10. These teams like Purdue and Vanderbilt, they're just going for the ride and just kind of there, and they're potentially making more money than them. So I think that North Carolina is what's going to set this whole thing off, and it makes a lot of sense for them to end up in the SEC just because of the regionality of it.
Yeah, it's been fascinating to watch. It's a ton of fun to watch and cover. It's with NIL and the portal and then realignment, like the sport that we know has changed so drastically. And I'm not one of these people that's like, we get comments every day, the sport's ruined and I'm going to stop watching. And I'm like, you're commenting on a college football YouTube. You're probably going to keep watching if you're watching me talk. But I digress. But it is fascinating to watch how much it is changing. And like I said earlier, maybe we end up in some massive super league or something crazy like that. But it's insane to think that like Florida State, located in Tallahassee, Florida, might be in the BIG10 soon, or a team like Virginia could be in the SEC at some point. It's just kind of it's weird to think about, and it really is kind of nuts. So, all right, maybe to close it out, where or when do you think, if you had to put a timeline on it, when do you think that pressure just becomes too much and Notre Dame eventually pulls the trigger?
I'm going to say 10 years. I think that these moves are the rapid movement that we got with the Pac-12 was timing based. It was because their TV deal was up and everybody panicked and freaked out. The ACC at the end of the day, because of how far down the line their TV contract is, that I think is going to slow down just the general process. So it might not be for a couple of years that we do see UNC, Florida State, and Clemson, Miami maybe make enough of a commotion that they end up leaving and departing. That's where I think that we shift potentially from 4 to 3 and maybe from 3 to 2. But for all of those things to happen, I really just do not think that Notre Dame is going to be one of the first teams to make that move. They would need to be offered something ridiculous just because, as we've talked about, they're a program that is holding themselves in a very high regard. They're going to treat themselves to the point where they need to be, swept off their feet with a tremendous, tremendous offer that is going to make it worth their while.
Yeah. Joe, where can people follow you? Where can they find more of your work?
At Joe DeLeon on Twitter, and then Ruffino and Joe Show on YouTube or wherever you catch your podcasts. Appreciate you having me on, TJ. It was great getting to catch up with you and talk some ball and some Notre Dame Fighting Irish.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate it a ton. Joe mentioned a little bit about UNC. I talked about their plight, specifically the fighting between their AD and their board of trustees. You can check that out by clicking the video on the screen right now.